First and Goal with your host, Big Bear and the Cooking Guy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to First and Goal. We are your hosts. I'm Big Bear T. Tyler Bansky.
I'm the curtain guy, Cole Schutte.
And we are within 3 weeks of kickoff. We are leading you guys into our Big Ten preview of the 2024 season. Note you're not going to see everybody tonight, hear about everybody tonight, because the Big Ten has expanded and it's really more like the Big 20. But we're going to kind of break this out into different segments. We're going to do 3 groups of 6. So you're going to hear 6 teams this week, 6 teams next week, and so forth, all the way up to kickoff. We are going to be covering the following 6. We have Michigan, we have Iowa, we have Rutgers, Minnesota, Illinois, and lastly, Purdue. Those of you watching us live on YouTube, you're going to be able to see some of the graphics we put up here. Those of you at home, we will break it down for you as you listen. Before we get everything started tonight, what we want to do is, remind you all, if you're not following the show, you really should be. Follow, like, and subscribe wherever you listen to us, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, if you're watching us live on YouTube and Twitter, or even if you want to keep up with our content on Facebook and Instagram, at @goal_first. You can find us most places. If not, look up First and Goal Podcast, and you will see us, no doubt. So, leading us into the first team of the night, we're going to be talking about the Michigan Wolverines. What we have here, we know we've talked about in the past, is the Big Ten model. We've done it for the Pac-12, and the model's kind of catching up as we lead up to opening kickoff. It's kind of getting up more odds. Initial figures we'll give you as we break down previews. For the Wolverines, the model is leading into 10 to 11 wins. We'll kind of lead you into that when we talk about their schedule. But as many say across college football, any sport in general, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. And so I'll hand it off to my Buckeye-loving friend, Cole. The 2023 Michigan Wolverines were phenomenal. They went 15-0, won the national championship, exceeded a lot of odds that a lot of people put on them. Does 2024 have those same expectations? What do we expect out of this Michigan team?
I think if you're asking Michigan fans, the expectations are the same, right? They've kind of grown used to this. Okay, 2021, 2022, 2023, you've been building up to that. You've made the playoffs, and now with the expanded playoffs, obviously there will be, the expectation that you at least get into one of those top 12 teams, maybe even more so than there was, the 4-team playoff. You want to talk about not just their run in general, but their run through this conference, right? They dominated. There's nothing else that you can really talk about it other than to say that they dominated. They were 27-1 in conference matchups since 2021. 3 Big Ten titles. They outscored their opponents, Big Bear, 1,085 to 439 over those 28 games, which, if you're curious, I did the math thanks to my handy dandy calculator. It averages out to a score of 39 to 16 in those contests, which is just absurd. And we all know how they did it, right? It was anchored by a consistently dominant defense, a strong running game, and they would just kind of chew teams into the ground. And ultimately, with a senior-laden program and high-end players at key spots, they climbed their way to the mountaintop with a 15-0 record and a national championship in 2023.
Yeah, I think that Rose Bowl in the semifinal game against Alabama really turned a lot of heads, because Alabama you always give that SEC edge. You knew Michigan was going to run the ball and they were going to be really, really strong. But the way that they took care of business in Pasadena, I think, turned them into the favorite for the national championship. And granted, they move into 2024. They don't have Blake Corum. They do have turnover. There's no J.J. McCarthy. They have pieces that have to fill in the gaps. And You're not really sure, I think, at this point what QB1 is going to look like. But other than that, I think that kind of leads us into our next topic, like the improvements that they have to make, maybe even the setbacks they're going to face. Where do you see that going as we move into 2024?
Yeah, so I'll start with the good news for the Michigan fans. Even with Jesse Mentor and 5 draft selections gone, the number 1 total defense from last year should pick right up where it left off. Anchored by names like Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, both of which make up what I think is arguably the best defensive tackle duo in the country. Will Johnson, who is one of the top players in all of college football, their star cornerback. They should be an absolute force, and I think they're going to need it. I think they're going to have to lean on that defense to keep them in a lot of games, especially early on, as the offense kind of still tries to find their identity with some very new pieces at some very key spots. And I think they will be able to do that, even if the offense is frustrating at times for their fans. And that leads me into the bad, right? Or rather concerns. We'll go concerns rather than bad.
Sure.
The offense loses J.J. McCarthy, Blake Corum, its 6 best offensive linemen, and the top 2 wide receivers in terms of production.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're going to struggle at times. And that's not to say that they're not going to be able to win games, right? I think it's just going to be very frustrating to some Wolverine fans who have grown accustomed, especially if you just kind of picked it up in the last couple of years, of how they would just kind of steamroll people, right? So I think you're going to have to give a little bit of grace to this offense as they figure it out, throughout the season. And there isn't going to be a whole lot of time to do it. Fresno State, I think, is, it's probably going to look like it's okay, but Texas is really where you're going to know if the offense can actually compete at a national level. But there's going to be frustration, and I think fans need to be willing and understanding of that, because their defense is going to be so dominant that it's going to help level it out in a lot of ways.
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned the first couple games on the schedule. We brought the graphic up for those of you watching at home. If you're listening on the road or wherever you're listening to us, we'll go through this schedule. They have Fresno State at home. Then they're at a neutral site against the Texas Longhorns. That's going to be a really tough game early in the season. A 3-game home stretch, Arkansas State, USC, and Minnesota. Then on the road to Washington and Illinois. They come home to play Michigan State and Oregon. On the road to Indiana, home against Northwestern, and then obviously the last week of the season at Ohio State, probably the biggest game on their schedule. Cole, you made good points, though. A lot of turnover on the offensive side of the ball, and I think that's where my focus went. We know that the defensive front's really stout, and they're going to be, solid like they were last year. But J.J. McCarthy did a really good job completing passes and moving the chains for the offense last year, and they kind of have to find that replacement. So Alex Orji has kind of been the talk a lot of the offseason. They like that he brings more of a dual threat presence to that offense than J.J. McCarthy did. He can move his feet a little bit more. The question I have, though, is he going to be able to move the chains enough and to complete at that same pace that J.J. McCarthy did last year? Because it was really phenomenal the way that he did that. But maybe that's where Jack Tuttle came in. As you might have seen in the news lately, Jack Tuttle's suddenly been on the radar for QB1. So I think there's a lot of unknown still at the QB1 position that Michigan still has to find out. So we'll see what happens there. I wouldn't be surprised if you see both in at least some capacity, at least early on, but you don't want to get in the same situation they were 2 years ago, where Harbaugh and company were trying to pick between J.J. McCarthy and Cade McNamara, and that just doesn't give an offense enough time to gel. I think maybe you see Alex Orji in a specific package that they can run certain plays with, but one of them is going to have to command the offense majority of the time. You talked about outside of the QB room, they do lose some wide receivers. They do return wide receiver Tyler Morris Jr. He really showed some serious promise at times last year, especially like in the Rose Bowl game. But outside of him and Loveland, you got Samaj Morgan's the next most experienced wide receiver, 22 career receptions. Behind him, you have Fred Moore. He only has 4 career receptions. So there's not a lot of depth at that position. And if you get midway through this season in this new Big Ten, where you have a lot more difficult opponents, we would like to say, you might face some attrition. And are those younger guys going to be able to come in and get the job done? So I think the middle of their schedule looks pretty decent to where maybe they can handle that. But this is where you might have trouble in certain games. And I want to circle on that neutral site game week 2 against Texas. So if Texas is able to run a pretty effective zone and limit the passing game, are they going to be able to give Donovan Edwards the rock enough times, to offset that? Because Texas has got guys like Trey Moore, who's a linebacker / D end. I mean, he can move around, versatility. And then you got Andrew Makuba and company in the backfield. So, if you become one-dimensional, it's gonna cause a problem. And that's just one example. You get later in the season, they do have to face USC. USC has a rejuvenated defensive backfield we'll talk about when we get to their segment in the coming weeks. And then obviously you have the games later when you get to November, where you have Oregon at home, and then you go on the road to Ohio State. So it's very interesting. I think if you look at the schedule, and the model has highlighted the key crucial games on Michigan's schedule are the ones we keyed on: Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State. What do you think? Is that where you're at, Cole? You think it's got to be?
Yeah, I think those are the ones that stand out the most. Well, it looks like my camera's messing up here, but yeah, I think those are the most obvious ones that a lot of national pundits have picked. But the kind of I guess the grouping that I was looking at is that September 21st to October 5th, the USC, Minnesota, Washington, and not necessarily for the teams that it involves. It's just how it kind of lines up in my mind, right? So Minnesota has a nice group of returning starters. I don't really see them as like a threat to pull off the upset. USC is going to be a strong contender in this, right? So those aren't necessarily going to be easy games to win, but having to go back to back with playing some tougher physical opponents. And then what really kind of strikes my attention is then in that third week on October 5th, you got to fly across the country to play at Washington. And I know Washington has a lot of their own problems in terms of replacing, talent and production, but that just feels like you want to talk about where that frustration is probably going to come to a head. It feels like that Washington matchup, right? Not in terms of Washington is a team that I'm sitting here going, oh, they're gonna beat Michigan. No, it's going to be Michigan is just going to have gone through this gauntlet of playing Texas on a neutral site. You get another game, USC, Minnesota, flying across the country, right? It's just a lot. And it's something that we talked about in the overarching terms in our last episode, right? Of just things that you have to pay attention to. And when you don't have that type of depth that you would necessarily like to have, I think that's where you can find some issues that maybe you weren't necessarily thinking about in the beginning of the season.
Yeah, nope, I agree 100%. Kind of wrapping things up on Michigan before we move on. Kind of a key question I wanted to ask to you specifically is do you think the Wolverines continue that momentum from last season? Do you think that even with those pieces changing, that they have what it takes to maybe make another college football playoff run?
I'm going to say this, and I know there's a lot of people that think I'm just going to be a giant hater here, but I'm approaching this the same way that I did with Cincinnati the year after they made the playoffs, right? The bar is so high, and looking at what is coming back, it feels like it's a lot to ask of this team, right? I'm not saying that they couldn't. We've seen stranger things happen in college football. But when the bar is 15-0 in a national championship, and the national champion this year may end up being 16-0. So you would literally have to cross that threshold to be there. I just don't think that with everything that has happened, with all of the coaches that have left, the strength and conditioning coaches that have left, all of the key pieces that were a part of that title run leaving, I don't think there's a whole lot of momentum to kind of carry you into this new season. I just think it's too much to overcome. Do I still think this is a really good team? Yes. Do I think they can still win double-digit games? Yes. Do I think a playoff spot is in the realm of possibility? Yes. But do I ultimately think the Wolverines have the pieces to repeat as national champions in 2024? No. I think they have some really nice pieces. You mentioned Loveland. I love Loveland. I think he's the best tight end in the country. I think he's going to be a buoy for whichever quarterback, Orgy or Tuttle, because he's going to be a guy that they can utilize as kind of a safety net, right? To kind of help keep the offense in rhythm, keep them on schedule. But he's not a guy that he's not going to be able to carry your entire team. You can't do that to a kid for 16 straight games. So I like what they have. I think they're still going to be a very good team. It's just you're asking a lot of a team that lost a lot, if that makes sense.
No, makes 100% perfect sense. And I think based on the current state of college football, all the changing things, realignment, transfer portal, NIL, all the things encompassing of which we started this show years ago talking about, I think leading into 2024, you very well could see a completely different top four than we saw last year. It's 100% possible, especially in this new playoff system. So would I be surprised if they make it? Absolutely not. Would I be surprised if they're 10th? I wouldn't be surprised about that at all either. So I think it's a good point, but the model shows 10 to 11 wins. Right now we're hanging with that. We'll see if it changes as we get closer to kickoff. So moving on to team number 2, we have the Iowa Hawkeyes. Currently the model is showing the Iowa Hawkeyes with 7 to 9 wins. This is a team that was soul searching for offense or offensive minded people for the last 12 months, at least. This is a team that finished last season with a linebacker at quarterback. Enough said, like that. There's nothing more we really need to say about that, but it's a team that plays amazing defense. So talking about that defense and their achievements and even their challenges going into 2024, Cole, what do you think of Iowa?
Death, taxes, shitty Iowa offense, and excellent Iowa defense. Right? Rinse, lather, repeat. It's a squad that ended the 2023. Yeah. Death, taxes, and Iowa's shitty offense. It's a squad that ended the 2023 season ranked as the 7th total defense. It brings back players like Jay Higgins, Quinn Schultz, Xavier Wampa. Like it's just going to continue because this is what Iowa does. This is what Iowa has become, right? Phil Parker has made a claim as one of the best defensive coordinators, not only in the Big Ten, but in the entire nation, right? And there seems to be a ton of really good defensive coordinators just floating around among the Big Ten. But this is what they're going to be. I think this is just kind of what they've put their identity on. It's what they know that they're good at, and I think it's going to continue in 2024. And you're also looking at a unit who you mentioned a linebacker playing quarterback, and I don't know if anybody willingly tuned into any of those Iowa games, but it was rough. I think he completed like 48% of his passes, and it was abysmal at times, but they still won 10 games in 2023, and it was solely on the back of that defense. And that's insane to think about when you think of how the game has evolved and how high scoring some of these offenses are. It really is impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And think about this. 11 straight winning seasons now for Kirk Ferentz and 3 10-win campaigns in the last 4 seasons alone. So just to show you how significant that is, And probably for Iowa fans at home watching this, for you to, tout that prowess over your foes in Iowa State, the Cyclones have never had a 10-win season in their history, first of all. Other Big Ten foes like Wisconsin and Nebraska, they've only had one in this millennium. So 10-win seasons are not easy to come by. And we're talking about an Iowa team that has no offense, or has been known to have no offense in recent years, but still able to win 10 games 3 times in the last 4. But I mean, Kirk Ferentz has to be one of the most underrated coaches in college football. I know Kyle Whittingham is one that, if you look at Walk on Richardson last week, when that question was asked, I talked about him. But Kirk Ferentz is a great coach. I think his coordinators need work. But if he had the right coordinator, I mean, we could be talking about a much better, more lethal Iowa team. Speaking of those coordinators, so Tim Lester now comes in at OC. The Hawkeyes are going to have a healthy Cade McNamara back. They're going to have tight end Luke Lachey, who I think is going to look to rival, Colson Loveland as the top tight end in the country and number 1 in your heart. This team, again, ended the season with a linebacker at quarterback. That's not a situation you want, especially a team that won 10 games. If you had a decent quarterback for half of that season, maybe you win more. The ceiling could have been the limit for that team. So obviously the highlight going into 2024 is going to be, can you find offense, and where will you find it? So looking at their schedule, again, got it up on the screen for you watching it at home. If you're listening, they start off the season with 3 straight home games. They have Illinois State, Iowa State, and Troy. They go on the road to Minnesota and Ohio State. They come home against Washington, hit the road against Michigan State, home against Northwestern and Wisconsin. They go out west to play UCLA before going all the way back across the country to play Maryland, and then finally finish off the season at home against Nebraska. So games that the model has highlighted at this point. They have Iowa State, rivalry game, obviously. Got to have that one highlighted. I don't think it really matters if your team's 0-12, or sorry, 0-11, maybe going 0-12, but you throw out the book in rivalry games. It's the oldest saying in the world. Washington is highlighted. Again, we're not sure what to see out of those Huskies. We'll talk about them in another week. There's Wisconsin, which is also a home game, so I think that might play in Iowa's favor. But then that stretch of November, luckily they get a bye week between UCLA and Maryland, so you don't have to go all the way in jet lag across the country. You might get a little reprieve back there in Iowa. But those last 2 weeks of the season, Nebraska being the last week, we're not really sure what we're going to see out of Nebraska yet. I think they're a team that could be top 5, could completely, need another year of development, but another team with a whole lot of upside. Are there any games on this schedule that, stick out to you, Cole, as a chance to slip up at all?
I'm kind of go to that middle of the season, and I know that they have a bye week in between them, but going to Minnesota, to Ohio State, Washington, and at Michigan State. 3 out of the 4 being away. Minnesota is a rivalry game. Ohio State is Ohio State, and going into Columbus is never easy for any program. You get Washington at home. So again, like you said, the travel isn't there, but that feels like a lot, right? Like you're coming off of a very physical rivalry game with Minnesota. Yes, you get the bye week, but then you have to go play one of the top teams in the conference and the country at their place. Come off of that, have to play Washington. Again, like you said, we don't know what Washington's going to be. They could be pesky. It could be a cakewalk. But then to have to leave again and go to Michigan State, and then all of that happening right before the sequence that you talked about, where you have another rivalry game with Wisconsin. You get then all of a sudden you're traveling across the country to UCLA. You get the bye week, Maryland, and then what we think will be a pretty decent Nebraska team. So they start out, there's pieces of the schedule that look fairly easy to navigate, but when you kind of put it all collectively together, I think there is definitely some chances to slip up. But I do like the Hawkeyes in a lot of these matchups. It's just that middle section there that I think they kind of get the raw deal of.
Yeah, I do think just there's a lot of teams on that list that I think could surprise a lot of people. I thought that Maryland is a team that I'm really high on. I'll talk about them in another week. Nebraska, we've talked about them endlessly. Wisconsin is not going to be a slouch. Luke Fickell is really building his culture and his program there. He's got Tyler Van Dyke now running that offense. Washington, again, another up in the air. And I think the only game you really write off from the start is I think Ohio State's probably a leg up on them enough to give them that win. So, but you have 3 to 4 matchups that could be very close. And if those don't fall your way due to no offense, wink, wink, that 10-win season, you're just going to kiss goodbye. Moving to our third team in the list, we have the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Model currently showing them with 6 to 7 wins, which I kind of think is on the low end if you look at this schedule that Rutgers has going for them. Considering everyone else in the Big Ten, you have to imagine that Rutgers has the easiest schedule out of all of them. We're going to jump right into that schedule. For those of you seeing it at home, you'll have it on the screen. We'll break it down. They have 2 home games to start the season against Howard and Akron. They hit the road to play Virginia Tech. They come home against Washington, hit the road against Nebraska, home against Wisconsin. They hit the road to play UCLA, come home against USC, go on the road to Minnesota, home against Maryland, on the road against Illinois. You know what? Actually, I think I got that backwards. But regardless, they finished the season with Michigan State. Look, the whole point of that second half of this season is that it's home away, home away, home away. Outside of those first 2 home games of the season, they really balanced out that schedule. But when you think about having a home game against UCLA one week and on the road against USC the next week, that's a lot. That's a lot of travel. That's New York to Los Angeles and then back for Minnesota the following week. That's pretty brutal. Key names that, you got to talk about. They got Kyle Monungai back. They have a lot of lethal wide receivers on that side of the ball. Miller and Dremel. I don't think they're going to have too much of a problem moving the ball on offense. They did bring in Callie McManus to run the offense at quarterback. But one thing that this Rutgers team's been known for in the past is just being pesky. And I think that's a lot to say about Greg Schiano. You looked at games last year against Michigan. They kept them to 31 points. They had Ohio State. They kept to 35, but never really let the Buckeyes get comfortable in that game. Penn State was only scored in 27. None of those 3 are even on the schedule. So right off maybe 3 of the top 5 teams in the Big Ten from your schedule, you got to be feeling pretty good. So the opportunity is there for Rutgers to win 8, 9 games. And I'm thinking that is the high end. So I'm kind of surprised that the model's low. Cole, what do you think about that?
No, I think, listing out the schedule, while in terms of teams, sure, it's not, doesn't look that bad, but that you can't kind of get comfortable and stay at home 2 weeks, in a row, that's kind of a raw deal. And especially when you throw in, as far as they have to travel, like you talked about when you go to USC, and even, going to Michigan State, that's a haul. Nebraska, that's a haul. That Virginia Tech game, that really sticks out to me because I think Virginia Tech is going to surprise a lot of people with how good they may end up being this year. I kind of have them in that upper echelon of the ACC this year, similar, in that category with Clemson and Florida State, that top 3 or 4 up in the ACC. So if Rutgers can go up in there and compete and show that they belong and even potentially come out with an upset win, I agree with you. I think this is a team that could very well end up with 8 or 9 wins on the season. You mentioned all the pieces, Monungai, Callie McManus. I got to see more out of the passing realm from Callie McManus. That's been the one drawback from him. I really like his dual threat abilities, but he is very inconsistent as a passer. But Rutgers knows who they are. and it's defense, and they run the ball. They actually run the ball 62% of the time that they have it. And I don't think that that's going to change at all with Monangai and 3 starters on the line coming back. So, look for more of Greg Schiano's Rutgers, right? They had a winning record for the first time since 2014. They won a bowl game. They have a lot of momentum going for them right now, and a lot of good pieces back. So I'm with you. I think this is a team that will very much find their way back to a bowl and potentially build on that 7-win campaign from 2023.
In 11 seasons as a Big Ten team, Rutgers has yet to have a winning conference record. That's rough. And Greg Schiano, again, he has them on the right path. With this kind of schedule, if they can handle those intangible things that we've talked about, the travel, having strong pieces on the receiving side of the ball, and being able to run the rock with Monangai, it's possible. Again, to have 8 wins, you can already count, I would assume, Howard and Akron as wins. So there's 2. It's just tough. UCLA maybe. So there's 1 conference win. Minnesota maybe. There's 2. Michigan State maybe. Again, the rest of them, it's tough. So can they get a winning conference record? Maybe. I think that's where the model gets confused too. The other thing I really wanted to talk about though is when we talked about Callie McManus coming in, transferring. He was at Minnesota, if I believe, but the Scarlet Knights haven't had a quarterback throw for over 2,000 yards more than once in the last 8 years. And I think they're hoping that Callie McManus can change that. But this is also a guy that really struggled throwing last season. He threw only 14 touchdowns. He had 9 picks. He's a big dude. He can have some mobility. He's got a strong arm. So that helps. You got great wide receivers. You got a great running back. I don't think the offense is much of a problem. I think it's more on the defensive side of the ball. They've been used to keeping them in games. They're getting the pieces back. The secondary plays strong. They're playing physical. But, this is the Big Ten. And I think the schedule's in your favor. So everything's sitting there, Rutgers. Go take it. Right now, you got a lot of doubt on your back, but prove us wrong. That's where I'm at.
No, I agree with you. I'm glad you talked about the defense. You're talking about a unit that ranks 16th in the country in total defense last year, 32nd in scoring, 41st in rushing, 10th in passing. Now, you talked about the defensive backfield. They lose Max Melton to the NFL, but they have a lot of veteran lane guys that will probably step up and keep them in that same realm. And they've got some nice transfers coming in, like Malcolm Ray from Florida State to come in on that defensive line. So, yeah, I think it's gonna be very similar to who they were in 2023. And like you said, the pieces are there. You got to go find a way to win some of them.
Yep. Moving to the next team, we are going to talk about the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Model currently projecting them for 6 to 7 wins. Again, very similar with the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. I wouldn't say that their schedules match up eye to eye because Minnesota does have some of the big boys on their list. We'll get to that here in a minute. How do I word this for Minnesota? PJ Fleck is a good coach. We know that. He's had a good track record. There's been a lot of talk in the offseason about maybe potential cultural issues going on in that locker room. Going into Big Ten Media Days, I know they talked about that. I felt like they kind of were putting those things to bed. And this is a chance to change that narrative. They return running back Darius Taylor, who I think is a big piece of that offense. Again, they don't have Callie McManus at quarterback anymore. They bring in Max Brosmer to be leading the quarterback room. He's had a good passing history throughout his college career. This is an interesting spot for Minnesota because I'm not sure they have enough pieces to be in that top tier of the Big Ten. I kind of have them in that mid to lower level of tier 2, kind of teetering on the level of tier 3. Is this a make or break season for PJ Fleck, do you think? I mean, do you think they give him more leash after this? I'm just curious on that.
I don't know. Like, do they really think they can do better than this? And I don't mean that in like a hurtful way, but it's like, this is probably the best Minnesota has been since the 60s when they were competing for national championships. I mean, he's had a lot of successful seasons there. Granted, he hasn't made it to the Big Ten championship game yet, but I know they took a step back, 6-7 last year, but 13 returning starters. You gotta see how Max Brosmer from New Hampshire turns out. If he can be more consistent, especially in the passing game, than Kaliak Mattis was, maybe you do take that step forward on offense that lets you be a better team. But yeah, there's a lot on this schedule that there aren't too many that I could just highlight off the rip and say, yeah, win. Maybe Rhode Island and Nevada. That's about all that I'll give them, because North Carolina, they lost last year. That's going to be another tough one. We talked about Iowa and their strengths. Michigan's going to be good. USC is no slouch. You got to travel across the country to UCLA. We both like Maryland. Illinois has some nice pieces. Rutgers has some nice pieces. Penn State, Wisconsin, like that's a very tough schedule to run. And I think if Minnesota were to kind of get to that 6-7 again with this setup currently, I think I would be pretty okay with that. But yeah, this is a tough draw, Big Bear. I don't know if there's much that I would kind of push back against with the model on this one.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking they go into that Iowa game 2-1. The wins against Rhode Island, wins against Nevada, but not winning that first week at North Carolina. It could be proven wrong completely. I mean, North Carolina has turnover of their own. They don't have Drake May anymore. Really not really sure what's going on in that offensive side of the ball. I know the defense is decent. Mac Brown's recruited well on that defensive side. So that's going to be a really interesting game week 1 to watch, because if Minnesota wins that, maybe we're talking about Minnesota being 3-0 going to play Iowa. Their first 4 games of the season are at home. And you talked about them. They're on the screen here. Here's something funny, though, about Minnesota's defense is they're 6-0 when they allow 24 points or fewer, 0-7 when they give up more. 24 points is the magic number. Now, again, they're playing Iowa. Iowa can't score many points. If they can hold Iowa under 24, can they win? So then we're looking at 4-0 Minnesota. Then you go on the road to Michigan. That's a loss. Let's just write that one off. Then you have to go all the way to USC. Come home against USC. God, I can't get my colors right here. Come home against USC. You go on the road to UCLA. That's still a trek. It's that second half of the season that I think really is throwing the model more to that 7-win mark, but it has some serious potential to be stuck at 6. Back to that offensive side of the ball, though, is just Minnesota hasn't seemed to be Minnesota of the past. When you think about them, this is a team that always dominated on third downs for many years. They always had good running backs. I think of Mohamed Ibrahim, that first game of the season a couple of years ago against Ohio State before he got injured in that game. They were moving the ball really well. I mean, that was a really strong Minnesota offense. That's what you want to see if you're the Gophers. Hasn't really looked the same in the last year or so. And, Darius Taylor, don't get me wrong, I really like him as a running back. I think he'll do a good job. Max Brosmer, his ability to pass efficiently is going to open that up on that offensive side of the ball. So that's where you can be in games like USC. If you're able to put up the points and you can take them to a 30-33 type ball game, you have a chance to be in that. But games where you're going to have to play some really stout defenses, you got Michigan, Penn State, even though they lose Manny Diaz, it's going to be a good defense. Finish the year against Wisconsin. It's really tough. I think that Minnesota, if they can put to bed a lot of those culture things that came up in the offseason and move forward, this is a team that has good growth going on. I think that PJ Fleck is holding that and moving it onward. But if we get to midway through the season, they're on a losing streak, and you have players kind of, it just happens. Players get in the face of the coach. I just think everything could go south really fast for this program. So I think the model's pretty accurate with 6 to 7 wins. If you had to, you got any other thoughts on this one?
No, I think you touched on it. The only other thing that I'd probably throw in there in terms of offense is, we talked about depth being a factor, right? Long season, a lot of games where you're going to need it, right? Dudes are going to get banged up. And I think, yes, I like what Max Brosmer brings. He was the leading passer in the FCS, and hopefully that translates over. And he's got his number one wideout here, right? And Daniel Jackson, who was all Big Ten second team. Who the hell is behind him? There really is nobody that we know of. And so somebody's going to have to step up, because it can't be Darius Taylor as your leading rusher and your second receiver. That doesn't provide for good outcomes, especially in the later half of the season, because you're going to get that dude in injury trouble by putting him out like that so much. So yeah, no, I'm with you, man. I think the model is very on point right here. And there's going to be games that they can win, but they're going to have to find their identity, and I think really stick to it and kind of grind it out this year.
Absolutely. Moving on to our next team, we have the Illinois Fighting Illini. The model has them almost worse than Minnesota and Rutgers. They have 6 to 8 wins. That's kind of a larger spread than the previous one. The upside is there, though. This is a Illinois team that finished 3rd in the Big Ten overall in offense. But what's really interesting about this Illinois team is that they had 3 losses last year by 5. 3 losses in the last 5 games by 4 points or fewer. But on the other side of the ball, they had 5 wins by 6 points or fewer. So this was a team with little to no margin of victory, very little marginal loss. They really hung toe-to-toe with a lot of their opponents. 9 bowl appearances in the last 31 years is not very good. I think Bert Bielema is the right coach for this job. I like Luke Altmaier. I almost had Illinois teetering on that level I have Maryland for this year, where, enough things go right, they could win. I think that higher level, that 8, maybe 9 games, that's pretty good in this new world of college football. Thoughts on the Fighting Illini, Cole?
Yeah, I think a lot of this depends on Luke Altmaier, like you said. Bert, as I like to refer to him, he's had good defenses, and I think they're kind of on track to kind of build that back up. They lost some key pieces along the defensive line, Newton, Randolph. But for the most part, Bert has always put out solid defenses. And while the offense had its moments last year, it kind of came and went with Altmaier, right? And so I want to see what he can do in another year in the system, another year older. Can you show me that you can be the guy for a program, right? You lose Isaiah Williams and Tep Riemann off the NFL, so you got to kind of find new guys that you can't just lean on all the time. But now you should be the guy, right? It shouldn't matter who is out there. You should be able to find dudes and kind of lead that offense down the field. Nice easy win to start the season against Eastern Illinois, but woof, Kansas, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Kansas is not Kansas anymore.
Nope, running into a buzzsaw.
6 years ago, right? 6 years ago, you and I would have been looking at this going, oh, okay, so 1-0, 2-0, 3-0, right? No, not anymore. Not with this Kansas. It's very similar to Minnesota or Rutgers, excuse me, thank you. Where you kind of get that one game with North Carolina and Minnesota and Virginia Tech and Rutgers, and it's like, give me to that game, because I want to see what that team looks like, because I think that is going to give you an encompassing view of what this team can and theoretically should be for 2024. So I think you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn a lot about some Big Ten teams come the second week of the season, right? We got a hell of a slate. You got Illinois, Kansas, you got Michigan, Texas. It's going to be, you're going to find out who is and who isn't in the Big Ten fairly quickly, I think. But yeah, Altmaier's, he's got to figure it out, and he's got to figure it out fast, because Penn State is going to have a solid defense, like you mentioned. And then, okay, let's see, best case scenario, you walk out of the first half of the season 4-2, right? Pretty solid. Okay, here's your thank you prize: Michigan, Oregon. Mm-hmm. Right? That's
brutal.
So then what do you do if you're 4-4, right? How do you respond against Minnesota, Michigan State, Rutgers, Northwestern? That's where I think we get to it. But yeah, I'm rambling here, but this is just one of those programs that, again, I just feel like there's a lot of question marks, and if it tips one way or the other, I think the whole season can kind of tumble down with it.
Well, the model kind of agrees with you, because the 3 games as highlighted, and again, it's highlighting games that it thinks are potential toss-ups. So it has at Nebraska's potential toss-up there in week 4. It has the last 2 games of the season at Rutgers, at Northwestern, both games on the road. But at that point, we're going to know who Illinois is. So those are either going to be really good wins, or those are going to be games where Rutgers is going to kind of be pulling themselves to maybe, be on the top tier of the Big Ten. It's that middle stretch that you mentioned. You have that Nebraska game, because, again, we have no idea where this Nebraska team's going. There's a chance to be really good. There's a chance to need another year. And then you go on the road again to Penn State. You have Purdue in the middle there with a bye week. So give it that, a little recoup time. But then home against Michigan, on the road at Oregon. Those are 4 of the Big Ten's maybe top 6, top 7 teams in a 5-week span. That is rough. At that point, you're going to be coming out of that to the last 4 weeks of the season, banged up. And, you got Minnesota and Michigan State. We talked about Minnesota. They're not bad, but they're not really ready to take that next step. So you might run into a bit of a buzzsaw there if you got enough pieces down and hurt. I think that's where the model comes in again with another 6 to 8 win mark. I think kind of like the Pac-12 was, there's a lot of these middle level Big Ten schools that are going to just devour each other. The Rutgers, the Minnesota, the Illinois, Purdue's, Northwesterns, it's going to be hard if you don't have the depth, you don't have the talent throughout your entire roster to carry you into those big games. So the last thing I want to touch on was just the defense didn't really have the same mojo it did 2 years ago in 2023. They were allowing 200 more points. They gave up 24 more points or more 9 times after allowing that many just once 2 years ago. So that was not good. You talked about they lost Newton and they lost Randolph. Linebackers, they have to do a better job getting pressure on opposing offenses. Otherwise, you are not going to keep points off the board, and you need to do a better job at that. Middle linebacker Dylan Rosiak led the team with 82 tackles. And the secondary, you got to come up with big plays. We've talked about a couple of teams. Again, Nebraska, Dylan Raiola is a true freshman. He knows how to sling the ball. Penn State, you got why am I blanking on his name? He's one of the biggest names. Drew Alar with Penn State. I was losing that one. Michigan, again, if Jack Tuttle or Alex Orji, they're going to be dual threat. You have to prepare on both sides. Oregon, you got Dylan Gabriel. I mean, the secondary is going to be crucial because there's a lot of good wide receiving cores out there in the Big Ten as well. So maybe if the defense steps up, they hang in more games, but the back and forth puts them at that 6 to 8 win mark. Any other thoughts on the Fighting Illini?
Not anything on the season, but super pumped to see those throwback uniforms they're going to wear against Michigan. I don't know if you've seen those floating around Twitter, but
yeah.
those are magnificent.
All right, we got one more team to preview on this week's episode as we kind of close out here. We have the Purdue Boilermakers. Purdue last season, boy, oh boy, they went 4-8. They didn't have that same momentum they had from a couple years back. We got the schedule up on the board. We'll run it down. They start off with 2 home games, Indiana State and Notre Dame. Notre Dame might be a neutral site if I'm not mistaken, but it's possible they do travel to Purdue. Correct me if I'm wrong. They go on the road to Oregon State, come home against Nebraska, 2 games on the road against Wisconsin and Illinois. They come home to play Oregon and Northwestern, on the road at Ohio State, home against Penn State, and then they finish the season with back-to-back road games, Michigan State and Indiana. I'm really excited for this Purdue team because I get to go watch them middle of the season. Not going to brag too much, but I get to see them play Oregon on October 18th. It's going to be their Battle Cancer night on a Friday night. They're probably going to make me sweat bullets, but nonetheless, things that I want to say about Purdue is the offense showed signs of being special, but it could all just explode. They have offensive coordinator Graham Harrell. We know him well from his days at Texas Tech. He loves to air raid. They're going to have Hudson Card back, who had an okay season last year. They're really looking for him to step up in his last year. Purdue was 4-3 in games when Card was completing more than 60% passes. They were 0-5 in games when he didn't. So his ability to throw the ball is going to be really, really big. And it's going to hurt because they lost top receiver Deion Burks. He left for Oklahoma. This offense is really kind of battling offensive line. Can they hold that same momentum they had in 2023? I'm not sure they do. And truth be told, the model has Purdue at 4-5 wins. The lowest one that we've gone through so far tonight might be one of the lowest ones we cover in our entire previews. Cole, give me your thoughts on the Boilermakers.
I actually like what they have on offense. You mentioned Hudson Card, and yes, 59% completion, 15 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, 8 interceptions and 11 starts. Not great, but he was third in the Big Ten in passing yards per game, right? So they were letting him go out there and kind of take his lumps, and I think that's what they needed to do. I think they were under no assumption that, last year was going to be some magical run, so they kind of let some dudes take their lumps, and if Card can take the next step, he's got a solid, running back behind him in Devin Maccabee. You have Jamal Edrine, hopefully I'm saying that right, who's finally healthy after, suffering a season-ending injury in camp last year. They attacked the portal, man. You have Georgia's CJ Smith, Denylon Morset, UCLA's Cam Brown, like dudes that can burn. And so I think Purdue is really looking to just open up the passing playbook and attack like Purdue is used to doing, right? And if you can do that and find some success in that, I think it's going to allow the running game. And I think Purdue is going to be able to put up some points this year. It's, you talked about the offensive line. They got their dudes in center, Gus Hartwig and tackle Marcus Mbow. They brought in some more transfers and junior college guys to kind of bolster that depth. So hopefully they can figure it out. I like where the offense is at. I think it's the defense that kind of gives me some hesitation. They have some nice pieces on the defensive line, but I gotta see that they can kind of give that, they can hold up and give the ball back to that offense at least early on in the season to kind of allow those guys to gel.
Yeah, this is the defense that was the worst in the Big Ten against the pass last year. They allowed 30 points per game. They struggled with consistency. They have a decent linebacker combo. They got Yanni Karloftis. They got Kedron Jenkins. They brought in from the portal. They got from Colorado, Kendrick Breedlove. They got from Georgia. They got Nyland Green. There's an infusion of some talent there in the secondary, but is that going to be enough on the defensive side of the ball? They have to make a massive improvement. And similar to other teams we've talked about tonight, in a 4-week span, they have a home game against Oregon. They go on the road to Ohio State and then home against Penn State. Those are 3 big teams. Luckily they don't have Michigan. They'd go for the quadfecta. It would be awful. It's just really tough sledding. I think they have the right leader in place. I like their head coach. I do like Hudson Card. I think that he fell short of his expectations last year, and I think he's going to have a much better year. It just depends on the turnover and the pieces you're bringing in out of the portal. Are they going to be able to produce at that level that they need? So if you had to point out one game, maybe upset opportunity on the schedule, is there one that sticks out to you as a potential upset at all?
Notre Dame gets a little more interesting to me because they just lost one of their main tackles to an injury for the entire season. I'm not calling that as an upset or anything like that. I would have to probably go Oregon State. I know, again, they lost a lot with their coach leaving to Michigan State. We kind of touched on that last episode, but still, if you can go out and get a non-conference Power 5 win away from home, I think that could be a pretty big jolt to the program and kind of an announcement that, hey, we're headed in the right direction, right? Because then you're headed back home to Nebraska 2-1, right? And Nebraska is another one of those games where the model has it marked as a toss-up, right? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Big Bear, is this the most toss-up games for any one of the teams we've discussed today? Because the model looks like it's highlighted 6 of them here.
Yeah, the model looks like a winter exam cheat sheet right now. Everything's highlighted. They have 6, if not 7 games on their schedule that the predictability is almost at toss-up level. It does have Oregon State. It has Nebraska. Again, Nebraska is almost on everybody's toss-up just because we won't know. And I think as we get closer to kickoff, the model might shift a bit there. So we'll keep an eye on that. Wisconsin, again, another one, very similar. Northwestern, the great coach, unsure on what other talent they got there, but Michigan State, Indiana, I would have to assume Purdue is pretty close to Rutgers in terms of having an easier Big Ten schedule. They do have to play 3 big dogs, but outside of that, everybody else is pretty comparable. So it's more about trying to win games against those teams to really carry your record.
Right. And I think that, not saying that you go into those games and go, oh, well, it's Oregon, it's Ohio State, who cares? But I'm saying if you can really kind of focus in on those toss-up games and go 3-3, go 4-2, you'll build on last year. You'll be bowl eligible in some of those scenarios. So, I think I was very interested by that, but this is kind of fitting, right? We've been kind of going back and forth with some teams, Illinois, Minnesota, Rutgers. We're like, I don't know. Like, this could be an 8-win team or it could be a 4-win team. We don't really know. This seems to be, the king of that for this episode because there's a lot to like about Purdue and there's a lot of toss-up games, and they are definitely a program that could go in one direction or the other. But I think that at Oregon State, I think, like I've kind of been pointing out, is just one of those games where you're going to find out, can Purdue hang for the rest of the year?
Yep, for sure. Hey, before we run out of time, we do have one more segment we want to cover here. Cole and I, for each group of 6 teams we cover in these 3 weeks of previews, we have what's called the keepers and the sleepers. We're picking a player from each, one player from these 6 teams that we think is, a keeper, going to produce at that same level, and a sleeper, a team, player that you're not really thinking about. Cole, I'm going to let you go first with your 2 picks. I'll give mine right after.
Absolutely. I'm going with defensive tackle Kenneth Grant. I mentioned him earlier in the episode, but I think he's going to be one of, if not the best interior defensive lineman in the entire country. And I don't think there's a team out there that wouldn't absolutely take him if he jumped in the portal. 6'3", 350 pounds. He was named as the number 3 on Bruce Feldman's freaks list, which if you haven't checked that out, please do check that out. It's always interesting to see what just kind of genetic animals are roaming around the sidelines on Saturdays throughout the country. He anchored that defensive line last year, and his numbers aren't staggering, but a lot of interior defensive linemen aren't. 29 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, 6 quarterback hurries, 5 pass breakups, 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery. But he's an anomaly for how big he is and how fast he can move. When you're talking about a 360-pound guy running a sub 5-second 40-yard dash, that's insane. I mean, he's hustling. And some of you who are college football junkies like us, if you remember him chasing down the Penn State running back, I think you kind of got a very good introduction into what Kenneth Grant is about. And I expect him to pick up where he left off last year and buoy himself right into a first-round pick.
Love it.
My sleeper is a guy that I have been familiar with for a couple of years because I wanted my Buckeyes to really get him, but he chose to stay home. Xavier Wampa is a strong safety for Iowa. Got some playing time his freshman year, kind of stepped into that role more last year, and I think he's going to really become one of the main contributors, if not the face of that secondary for the Hawkeyes. Again, the kid that's not going to kind of blow you away with his numbers. 42 tackles this last year, 11 or 12 tackles the year before, 2 interceptions on his career, but he's just a kid who knows where he needs to be and is there, which is very fitting for what Iowa does, right? They don't do anything flashy. They're not going to kill you with, anything outstanding or jump off the screen to you, but he's going to be an anchor in the back of that secondary and an absolute main reason of why Iowa's defense is going to pick up where it left off last year. Much like Michigan's defense is, in my opinion. So those are my 2 guys. I know that's probably not the truest sleeper pick, but he was a name that kind of has been rattling around my mind for a couple weeks since you brought up this subject. But I'll toss it to you, Big Bear. Who do you have floating around in this group that you're looking at?
Well, I think about sleepers as just people that no one's really talking about. And as good as Iowa's defense was last year, not a lot of people talked about them. Keeper pick on my side is Rutgers running back Kyle Monangai. This dude is a bell cow back. I mean, yeah, he's elusive. He's got speed. He's got a lot of power. Rutgers is going to use him to their advantage this entire season. And if you look at him across his college playing career, as a freshman, he played in 11 games, got 236 yards. Sophomore, played in all 12 games, 400 yards. Last year, 13 games, 1,200 yards. This dude is continuously growing and growing, and they're happy to give him the ball. I wouldn't be surprised if he runs for 1,500 yards the way he's freaking putting up yards and points. And so if you're playing fantasy football in terms of college football, Kyle Monangai is a pretty good pick. Sleeper pick, I am going with kind of along the same lines as you, is a defensive tackle from Iowa. I got Yaya Black. He came back. He decided not to go to the draft. This is a guy that had a 51 tackle season last year, included 5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks. He played in all 14 games last season. He was an anchor on that defensive line, probably should be another anchor again this year. He's played in 40 games in his 4 seasons with the Hawkeyes, and including 4 of them in that COVID 2020 season. But last year was his first year as a starter, and he proved that he had a dominating presence inside. Again, we've talked numerously about this Iowa defense and how stout they are as opposed to their offense. But it was a big jump last year when he was a starter coming off of that 2022 season. He only played in 9 games, had 11 tackles. I think that this is a guy with a full season under his belt as a starter, anchoring a defensive line and a top 10 defense, top 3 defense in the Big Ten. I think, sky's the limit for this guy. And I think he's going to really raise his draft stock this year. So if you're sleeping on Yaya Black, don't, because this dude's for real. Brings us here to the end of the show. This is our first segment of the Big Ten previews. Remember, once again, if you're not already, follow, like, subscribe. We're on every social media, most podcast areas. If you're listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, you can watch our videos on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe to us and the Walk On Red Shirts. Check out walkonredshirts.com. So much content, articles, predictions. Guys, come on. If you're not looking, you're missing out, because we're spoiling you. And I cannot stress that enough, spoiling you. Cole, final thoughts before we send the people home?
No, like I said, just good to be back into doing this. We're 16 days away from week 0. Starting to get that itch every day, just kind of keeps on growing and growing. I'm ready for college football, man.
Oh, me too. And for those of you at home who are waiting for us to tell you who next week's previews are, we're not gonna. So make sure to tune in. And again, like I stressed, follow us, because you'll know when that episode drops. 2 more weeks of Big Ten previews ahead, 12 more teams to look at, 4 to 5 potential contenders to cover. This has been First and Goal.